Thank you. Good morning, everyone. I'm David Elkin, the co-director of the Consult Liaison Service at San Francisco General, and many of you know of my interest in the humanities, which is one of the reasons why I'm so excited about this morning. Today we have Dr. Jake Izenberg, one of the two, but soon to be three psychiatrists at San Francisco's Jail Psychiatric Services. Jake is actually a graduate of the residency program, and I had the great pleasure of working with him a few years ago. Today he's talking on mental health in the sorted out city, examining the legacy of racial injustice in American public urban policy. I'll read you a very brief blurb about some of what Jake has written. Jake is interested in the social and political structures that have shaped the contemporary landscape of mental health inequity. Much of his research and writing has been focused in particular on American urban policy and the legacy of racial injustice. He's also partnered with other faculty to develop a curriculum in policy, advocacy, and structural competency for UCSF psychiatry residents, and I should add, faculty. In his clinical role providing psychiatric care at San Francisco County Jail, Jake is fortunate to collaborate with a devoted team working at the interface of mass incarceration, the ongoing crisis in community mental health, addiction, and homelessness. He's a well-respected clinician, instructor, and mentor who was also works in psychiatric services, PES, at San Francisco General. Before we start, a brief reminder, there'll be a Q&A session at approximately 9:20. If you have questions, please submit them via the public chat box. And thank you very much, and please join me in giving Dr. Jake Izenberg a very warm welcome.
Thank you. All right, I'm going to start the screen share here. And I'm going to start the presentation. Okay. So this, welcome and thank you, David, for the kind introduction. It's really an honor to be able to give this talk this morning, and also to share this Grand Round series with, I think, some absolutely incredible people who have been great inspirations, and in some cases mentors to me, who have given talks about mental health equity issues prior to today. So as you know, this talk is called Mental Health in the Sorted Out City, examining the legacy of racial injustice in American urban policy. And the term sorted out is borrowed from someone named Thomas Hanchett, who wrote a book called Sorting Out the New South City about Charlotte, North Carolina, and describing how Charlotte became segregated in the late 1800s and early 20th century. And the sorting of American cities essentially refers to the ways in which they became segregated along lines of class, but really, if anything, more so race. And I'm going to talk about that as part of this talk, but I think the idea of the sorted out city really speaks to, in some ways, what I would consider the kind of the original sin of the American city. And, you know, I think in this current moment, COVID has really put our cities to the test and highlighted some of the deep inequities that are seated there. And I think that makes it all the more important that we think about our cities, especially as we try to recover from this pandemic and try to rebuild cities that have suffered so much during this time. I have nothing to disclose. Learning objectives. So I want to, at the end, I'd like for you to be able to think of two examples of racially unjust urban and neighborhood policy in the United States, and to describe the impact of these on the urban landscape. Describe the concept of collective efficacy, which is the primary theoretical framework I've drawn on for linking community functioning to mental health, and cite at least one possible approach to addressing some of these inequities that affect community mental health. And I want to emphasize that part of my focus is on the concept of structural competency, which is teaching clinicians, teaching medical trainees the structures that define and shape our society at the political and social level. And I think that for all of us, for those of us in today's group that are clinicians, I think it's incredibly important to be familiar and to understand these, even when they don't obviously linked to our clinical work because they truly shape the experiences and the health outcomes of our patients. And, as an example, at least once a day, I treat a patient. I would say at least once a day, if not more, I treat a patient at the jail who is suffering from really diagnosable PTSD related to community violence and trauma, witnessing violence and homicide in their community, often multiple times over the course of their life. And so if we don't understand what's driving community-based violence, then we're missing an incredibly important point about this particular patient population. And the same could be said for any number of other health issues. Briefly to outline today's talk, in part one, it's split up into 5 parts. Part one, I'm going to talk about segregation and redlining. And in this part, I'm going to draw a lot on the work of historians, including Richard Rothstein, who recently published a book called The Color of Law, which many of you may be familiar with, and which talks about these issues in detail. In part two, I'm going to talk about displacement through policy. And here I'm really going to draw on the work of my mentor and colleague, Mindy Foley-Love, who has written a great deal on urban renewal in particular, and talk about its impact on a neighborhood locally. Part three, I've called Legacies, looking at the impact of these processes in urban space. And here I'm going to talk about some of my own work in looking at main streets. Part four is about social integration, really drawing from sociologists who have tried to understand collective social dynamics in neighborhoods to think of a way we can link what we're seeing in the cities to mental health. And then in the end, we'll look ahead to some of the challenges and potential solutions that we're facing. I'll just make a point about my approach in this talk. It's not really, I think as many of the talks that have been given in this year's Grand Round series are, it's not really a traditional Grand Rounds where I'm going to lay out a bunch of background and then talk about research findings from my latest work. This is really about a synthesis of work I've been doing over a 10-year period. And that work involves a lot of on-the-ground research, qualitative research in the urban space, epidemiologic research, as well as drawing on and tying together historical, sociologic, and urbanist sources to really put together a framework and a model for understanding the relationship of neighborhood inequities and mental health. The talk focuses on 3 places primarily: Essex County, New Jersey, where the Main Street study that I'll discuss was focused; Detroit, Michigan, which is a place that is close to where I grew up and where I've spent a lot of time observing and trying to understand the urban landscape; and the Bay Area, which is where we all are, and I think is really instructive and familiar to us. And I just want to mention here that as I touched on before, a lot of this work I owe to a lot of the work I'm going to present here was done in collaboration with Mindy Foley-Love, who's a mentor, been a close mentor and a friend and colleague of mine over the last decade or so. And I will point out particular work that she's done that is folded into this talk, but I just want to acknowledge the role she's played in everything that I'm going to be presenting. So that gets us to this, and I'm not going to dwell on this for too long, but I want to point out that the life expectancy gap between the wealthy, this is a map of Detroit, by the way, and you can see Wayne State University and Comerica Park. Those reflect downtown Detroit. Far to the east, you see Grosse Pointe Shores. That's a wealthy, predominantly white suburb. Notice the life expectancy gap is about 13 years. This neighborhood where the life expectancy is 69 years is an area of Detroit that's been fundamentally decimated. And before that process happened, there were one large conglomeration of neighborhoods there called Black Bottom and Paradise Valley. And those were some of the predominant dense Black neighborhoods of Detroit in the early 20th century. And this is what they looked like in 1939. This is a view looking north from closer to downtown Detroit. And I just, as mental health professionals, I think it's fair to ask us to just get in touch with our feelings and to look at this and think, how do you feel when you look at this picture? How do you feel about this street? What do you think it would be like to walk down this street? Notice the church in the background. upper left corner, because I'm going to switch to this picture now. And you see that same church. How do you feel when you look at this picture? You know, what do you think about walking down this street? Just hold that comparison for a second, because understanding how we got from A to B is a lot of what this talk is about. And I just want to lay out that contrast up front. And don't forget to imagine the noise of the highway, the smoke and pollution. Think about a freezing Michigan winter and trying to cross this bridge in the sleet and snow. So with that, I'm going to talk a little bit about segregation, because Black Bottom, Detroit, is a good example of a neighborhood that arose through the many processes that created segregation. It was a segregated Black neighborhood, and it was a neighborhood that was one of the few at that time where Black residents moving to Detroit were able to freely locate. This is, again, to draw in Detroit, a map from recent census data showing how segregated the area is. So the blue dots represent the Black population, the white population is represented in red, Hispanic population represented in orange. And you can see that there's relatively homogeneous distribution of these groups of people. And over the years, Detroit's become a largely Black city as white people have fled to the suburbs. That happened predominantly in the second half of the 20th century. And so you see how that's reflected. The hard line moving east-west towards the north where blue and red meet, that is essentially the border of Detroit. American cities were not always so segregated. I'm just going to quickly show this graph, which shows indices of isolation and dissimilarity in American neighborhoods, in effect demonstrating that American cities became segregated much more segregated from 1900 to the mid 20th century, a little bit less so today, but this is a process that took place during the 20th century primarily. And how did it happen? So I mentioned The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein, and again, I want to just call attention to that book and its influence on my understanding of this topic, and encourage, throughout this talk, I'm really going to encourage you to go to some of these sources yourself if you're interested. Rothstein lays out a number of ways that American cities became segregated, but the main point is that it was through policy. And some of those policies include racial zoning and other exclusionary zoning codes. Intimidation, vandalism, and force is not, I would argue, is not policy necessarily, but it's certainly facilitated by policies that look the other way. For example, failing to prosecute people who vandalize or engage in violence against Black residents and their property. And discriminatory lending and mortgage insurance practices that not only favored white Americans, but actually mandated segregation. And I'm going to talk about all these very briefly. Zoning. Zoning is a way that cities determine how land is used. New York introduced the first zoning code in 1916. For those of you who own property, if you may know that you're in R1 or whatever the case may be, and that you can't just go ahead and put another unit on your property. That's because of zoning codes. You can't open a convenience store in the ground floor of your house because of zoning codes. Well, these codes are rooted in racism. In San Francisco in the late 1800s, introduced laws to regulate where Chinese business people could own laundries. And that was really out of xenophobia. Racist zoning was used to regulate where different kinds of people could live, but the explicit use of race in zoning was ended in 1917 by the Supreme Court. However, exclusionary zoning is alive and well today. And this kind of zoning does things, for example, saying you can only build a single family home. And that was incidentally pioneered right here in Elmwood. I live in Oakland, near the border of Berkeley. And the neighborhood, the beautiful, very beautiful neighborhood and thriving neighborhood of Elmwood, but it also has a legacy of originating a use of single family zoning, which is in effect a way of preventing people without the means to purchase a single family house from moving into the neighborhood. And that's been demonstrated to be have the effect of excluding people of color as well as other working class people. Restrictive covenants, you may be familiar with these. These are deeds that for essentially the first half of the 20th century allowed people who were developing or selling land to mandate that no future buyer could be a person of color. And this is an example on the left of one of those types of deeds. And on the right is an example of the kinds of intimidation, that I think you have seen in the 20th century. So this is just a statement, but in effect, it's a form of violence and intimidation. Now, this is a topic that is quite big, the FHA and VA loans, but I want to talk about the picture for a second first. So sometimes this picture, what is depicted in this picture is sometimes called the Berlin Wall of Detroit or the Wailing Wall of Detroit. It was built in 1941, and the question you might be wondering is why? And the answer is FHA mortgage insurance. So the Federal Housing Administration was developed in the 1930s to help promote home ownership, and it was a massive vehicle by which the government underwrote private mortgage loans and mortgages for the development of property, primarily suburban property in the post-war period. It underwrote roughly 60+% of all mortgages between the 1930s and the 1950s, and virtually all of these went to white home buyers. The FHA, in fact, not only did most of the loans go to white home buyers, but the FHA would often not insure a loan or back a development that was not segregated. And this wall is essentially a perverse memorial to that stance, because what happened was a developer in Detroit wanted to build a suburban development, and the FHA determined it was too close to an existing Black community, and basically worked out a deal with the developer that said they could only build the new development if they put up a wall as well, separating it from the existing community. So that's the extreme lengths that this took, extreme extent that this took. And that gets me to a transition into this concept of redlining and disinvestment. And why are these two things linked? Well, the logic that, at least on paper, the FHA deployed to sort of justify its thinking had to do, they didn't say we're going to explicitly be racist here, as people rarely do. They said, investments in this area are too, quote unquote, high risk. Earlier in the 1930s, the Homeowners Lending Corporation was created to shore up private mortgages that were faulty under during the Depression. And Holk, which is the acronym for this organization, hired assessors who used race, among other things, but primarily race, as a criterion in assessing neighborhood investment risk. And they marked on these maps, which are now famous and many of you have probably seen, in red, the neighborhoods that they deemed highest risk, which were frequently, almost invariably, the neighborhoods that were populated by people of color, as well as immigrants and other people that at the time were seen as, that were essentially, there was an effort to exclude. And Holk itself was short-lived, but this logic, this idea that neighborhoods of color are higher risk, that they're not worthy of investment, of rehabilitation, of maintenance, of that the people in them are not capable or deserving of home ownership, that logic has really become foundational in American urban policy in the 20th century. And that is really, when people say, look at what happened to redlined neighborhoods, they're really talking about this logic and how damaging and destructive it has been. And I want to make a key point, which is that segregation and exclusion create the condition for targeted disinvestment. When you facilitate segregation and isolate neighborhoods of color, then it's much easier to turn and say, now these are the problematic neighborhoods, even though as a government, as a people, you've had a hand in establishing and creating those neighborhoods. So segregation and exclusion create the conditions for targeted disinvestment, dismantling and displacement. And with that, I'm going to move to displacement. So now we have neighborhoods that are segregated, and we have a process beginning by which they're being disinvested, and through which people in those neighborhoods are not able to get financing to buy their houses, to rehabilitate them, et cetera. When you have this type of situation, you're set up for the next phase, which is displacement and fracturing. And I'm going to get into detail on this, but I just wanted to show this image, which sort of blew my mind when I saw it. Because one of the chief instruments by which American cities were fractured was through the placement of freeways. This was a vision of the San Francisco Planning Department of a city sliced up by freeways. And I just want you to try to imagine if they had built the Panhandle Freeway, which literally was going to bisect, go right through where that beautiful Panhandle Park is today. So I want to talk about urban renewal, and this is something that my mentor, as I mentioned, Mindy Foley Love, has written extensively about, and I think is really a foundational process in the fracturing of urban communities. It's an example of mass displacement through urban policy. It was a federal program originally authorized under the 1949 Housing Act. Large amounts of money for quote unquote slum clearance and redevelopment were set aside. Cleared areas were replaced with public housing projects, civic arenas, and highways, and often, as for example, in the map before, highways showed you, and at times just empty space, projects that were never completed. Urban renewal was experienced as a deep and enduring trauma in communities affected by it. And in particular, the book Root Shock by Dr. Foley Love is a really good telling of that story. Hundreds of communities were displaced. By her estimate, over 2,500 projects affected more than 900 cities. And I'm going to give one example right here in San Francisco, which I think is a really telling example and one that's been talked about quite a bit recently. So this is the Fillmore District. This is a famous picture by the photographer David Johnson looking south down Fillmore from the Fillmore Post intersection. The neighborhood has a fairly rich but also complicated history. After 1906, the earthquake of 1906, it increasingly became home to a large Jewish population. There were a number of synagogues. There was even a Yiddish school. Later, it also was home to Japanese American community, as well as increasing population of Black residents. It was one of the more integrated neighborhoods, really in the country. Internment in the 1940s, however, the internment of Japanese Americans, which was its own forced displacement, left a lot of vacant homes and businesses, and with limited options for where else they were able to move due to exclusion, increasing Black population that was moving to the city during the World War II era, often to work in industrial jobs, moved into that neighborhood. It became a very vibrant Black community in the 1940s and 50s and was described often as the Harlem of the West. And again, I just want you to sort of put yourself on the street, think about how you feel looking at the street. It's, I see a vibrant street. I see a street lined with businesses, packed with people. I just want you to sort of feel what that street feels like. But the Fillmore was redlined. As you saw, you may have noticed in the San Francisco map that Fillmore was one of the areas that was redlined. And therefore, cut off from investment, it became somewhat overcrowded. The building stock deteriorated somewhat. So it was a vibrant neighborhood. It was in need of some support, some rehabilitation of the buildings, but it was still vibrant. But city leaders began to look at it differently. And with the 1949 Housing Act and some California legislation that also facilitated urban renewal, city leaders began to plan for the dismantling of this neighborhood. The area was held up as a quote unquote slum, which is a term used by city leadership to justify the destruction of neighborhoods. And this is what they did. Starting in the 1950s, they planned for and then executed massive displacement and destruction of the neighborhood. They built the Geary Expressway, and they removed population and local businesses en masse. It's worth noting that the Black population in San Francisco plummeted from around 13% in 1970 to 6% today. And you can't solely blame the urban renewal of the Fillmore, but it was one process of displacement from which a lot of people were never able to fully recover. And even people like London Breed have talked about the impact that this left on them as growing up. I want you to see how total the destruction was. This is from the 70s, and it's a massive area, which is today surrounding Fillmore Street. That shows you the extent of the destruction. And I'm just going to let this quote stand on its own from James Baldwin. I'll just give you a moment to read it. James Baldwin, the playwright, author, civil rights activist, came to San Francisco to film a documentary, actually, produced by KQED, looking at the Black experience in San Francisco. And with respect to urban renewal, this is what he said. And his coinage of the term Negro removal has became really a rallying cry for communities. This is what the Fillmore looks like today. And the caveat that this was taken by my colleague, Colin Buzza, during the pandemic. This was a day where I can tell you from my own experience in certain other neighborhoods, the streets were packed, and the streets of the Fillmore are not packed. And where there were once a wall of businesses, now there's this sort of extended, sort of strange bus shelter thing over a highway. And this is what the highway looks like. Urban renewal is the focus, and I just want to point out that neighborhoods like the Fillmore resisted urban renewal, and in some cases stopped the worst or of the plans, or some of the plans, from happening. But of course, a lot of damage was done. So I want to give credit and recognize the community organizing that went on in the Fillmore, the power that people put together to resist, but they were not able to resist a huge amount of damage. And as a result, what was once the Harlem of the West is become something of a shell of that former self. There's other forms of displacement that have occurred throughout the century, and I just want to call attention to those. I'm not going to get into detail on them, but planned shrinkage, which removes services from areas of the city, including fire services, that famously happened in the Bronx, where much of the Bronx burned to the ground because of the removal of fire suppression. Deindustrialization, mass incarceration, which is a form of displacement that predominantly removes young men of color from their neighborhoods. Hope 6, which tore down quote unquote failed housing projects, but then failed to replace them with the same amount of housing. Gentrification, which is another phenomenon that I've done some research on, which really is a way of changing who the city is for, and thereby displacing people either physically or culturally. And eviction. Eviction, by the way, for those of you familiar with the work of Matthew Desmond, he's made the argument that eviction is arguably the largest driver of instability and displacement within poor neighborhoods, and I'm not talking about gentrifying neighborhoods, I'm just talking about poor neighborhoods in general, and it's a constant source of churn within these neighborhoods. So segregation and exclusion create the conditions for disinvestment, dismantling, and displacement, and mass displacement and dismantling of communities fractures the urban space. So what happens when we fracture the urban space? Well, here's where I'm going to talk a little bit about main streets. Why do I want to talk about main streets? Well, I had the honor to be involved in the Main Street study, which was really over a decade-long project by Dr. Fullylove and colleagues, including myself, looking at main streets as a quintessential urban space. These are a modern-day forum. They serve for social interaction among different kinds of people. They're centers of community life. They're free. They're open to all. We go there to eat. We go there to be seen. We go there to protest, to celebrate. And so when people talk about, taking to the streets, they usually mean the main streets often. And that's why I think main streets are worth talking about. And this photo is from Detroit. It's actually of an old pawn shop that was defunct and then turned into a restaurant. And this is sort of meant to just convey the way that main streets change and evolve over time. And this main street has struggled in many ways. It's a massive road. It's typical of Detroit, Michigan, where this is located, but also it's carved out, people have tried to carve out some kind of life there still. So let's go quickly describe the Main Street study. This was a multi-phase study, and the Essex County phase was the phase that I was heavily involved with. And in this phase, we conducted systematic street level observation, participation, review of historical maps, aerial photos, secondary and primary historical research on main streets in all 23 municipalities of Essex County, New Jersey. I'll show you where that is in a moment. Main streets were evaluated for social function and features of the urban space and context associated with social life. And we developed the box circle line tangle. The tangle was added on later in the work model of main streets as a way of conceptualizing the scales of urban space in relation to social life. The levels of the model really are meant to be thought of as units of analysis for the tying of physical and contextual features of Main Street to the social function and social life of the Main Street. This is Essex County, just to give some context. It's a large county. It's diverse geographically, racially, economically. It's just adjacent to New York, and it contains everything from a dense large urban core in Newark, New Jersey, to far outer, almost rural suburbs. I'll show you what we came up with before showing you some of the data, so to speak. This is the box circle line. I mentioned the tangle came later. And these are features, again, of the street that relate to social function. The box really just describes the Main Street scape itself and the features that allow people to use it for social life. The circle describes the neighborhood surrounding the Main Street and is in effect the tissue that sustains the Main Street. And the line is meant to conceptualize the Main Street in relation to the broader community and acknowledge the fact that main streets are streets which people use for transit, and that our experience of community life happens in a sort of a path. We're not static, we move through space, and so we need to conceptualize our movement in communities as motion and rather than stasis. So let's talk about the box for a second. You all know what a good Main Street feels like. I don't think a lot of this is intuitive. So look at, these are two main streets that are thriving. One is in the largely Black and with a large Caribbean community of Orange. That's a sort of a second ring suburb of Newark. That's on the bottom. And the other one is in the Ironbound, which is a multi-ethnic neighborhood in Newark, and really one of the few neighborhoods of Newark that's managed to thrive and be stable over the years. And you can take a look. First of all, you see a lot of people out on the street. We tended in this study, we timed our visits to sort of control for variations in timing and weather to the extent possible. And you'll notice that in both of these situations, you see people out, you see a tight enclosure, you see businesses that are permeable and open to the street and facilitate exchange. You see features of walkability that are urban planning features. You see the preservation of local heritage in the business mix. Compare that to two different types of communities that are struggling with respect to their main streets. On the bottom, you have East Orange. That's an inner ring suburb just east of Orange, which is just to the left of it in this slide. East Orange is a bit closer to Newark, and in contrast to Orange, has struggled deeply. And you can see how the main street in East Orange is essentially only half of it is still standing. The other half is a giant parking lot with a Wendy's. Above that, you see a suburban main street that is dominated by cars. You know, standing on this corner is not a pleasant experience. That was part of the research, was participant observation, and I can tell you that standing on that corner was not a pleasant experience. It's a wealthy suburb. It's a very wealthy suburb, and yet its main street also is struggling. When we moved out to look at the neighborhood surrounding the main streets, we noticed that main streets that were thriving tended to be surrounded by dense, walkable neighborhoods. There were sidewalks. There were not excessive gaps in the neighborhood. There were not barriers to access to the main street. But in East Orange, for example, the one that I showed you earlier on the bottom right corner, you see how much of the area surrounding the main street is taken up by parking. You also see a massive freeway to the right, which is actually the south in this image, that effectively cuts off access to the main street from large swaths of the residential area nearby. When we looked at a map of the county, we noticed something very interesting, which is that you can almost see rings of the Main Street function. So notice how close to Newark, with the exception of the East Ward of Newark, the main streets in Newark itself were struggling and not functioning very well from a social life perspective. The next ring we're doing a little bit better, but often struggling quite a bit as well. Beyond that, you have a number of main streets that are thriving. And then way out into the suburbs, you have main streets that are struggling again, but for different reasons. I want to show you the old redlining map of Essex County and just point out that this is a bit complicated. So you'll notice some of the low functioning main streets are in redlined areas or areas adjacent to redlined areas. So these are main streets that were effectively destroyed and dismantled during Newark's own urban renewal phase and mass displacement of people. Sometimes it was the neighborhoods adjacent to redlined areas that actually were deeply affected. And in East Orange, for example, it was freeway construction that really did a huge amount of damage. But you'll notice also some of, and I don't have arrows to point this out, but some of the outer ring suburbs also were not very hospitable, was the term we used to describe supportive social function. And that really had to do more with, when we looked at the history and urbanism of the county, it had to do with the way the streets were built. They were built for cars, effectively, and so they were never built for people. And that was a sort of a different parallel phenomenon. The streets that were thriving were effectively those which were old enough to have been built for people, but had escaped the worst devastation wrought by urban renewal, displacement, disinvestment, and so forth. So in summary, what we observed in Newark was this next sort of phase of this story, which is that the fractured urban space becomes inhospitable for social life, for people. And, you know, there are different ways to get there. I've been talking a lot about the segregation, redlining, disinvestment, displacement of predominantly Black neighborhoods in this urban core and inner ring, but there were also failures of design in the wealthier suburbs outside of the central city area, and that's also been a concern. So now I'm going to move briefly to social integration, because here I'm going to try to draw the link to mental health, to community mental health, and the link that, as we propose, is to be found in the social life of communities. Certainly there's other factors too. There's pollution from freeways, there's all kinds of environmental justice issues. There's the other policies that are ongoing. There's a lack of healthcare resources, but social integration, I think, tells a really important story here. And this is a picture of Emil Durkheim, who was a sociologist in Europe in the late 1800s who investigated suicide and theorized that certain subset of suicides could be attributed to a sort of a breakdown in the social order. And so in some ways, he is one of the fathers of social psychiatry, you could say. Flash forward half a century to a study called the Sterling County Study. In this study, Alexander Layton and colleagues undertook what I consider to be a seminal study in social psychiatry. This took place in a county in Nova Scotia that is not called Sterling County. That's a pseudonym. And it was a longitudinal study in psychiatric epidemiology. And, you know, certainly limited in some ways by the methods available at the day, but it was very comprehensive and included detailed psychiatric medical evaluations, interviews with local healthcare providers, and participant observation and sociologic investigations of the communities, looking at various different communities. And the key finding was that the extent of social integration in a community was a better predictor of the rate of psychiatric distress within that community than the socioeconomic status of the person So it was better to be a lower socioeconomic status individual in a integrated community defined as a high functioning social networks intact community institutions, et cetera. It's better to be a lower socioeconomic person living in that community than someone of means in a disintegrated community. And I apologize, I think these slides got reversed in order. So this is the methods of the study. Flash forward to 2000, and we see an increasing interest in social dynamics and health. Although I have to point out, I think as somewhat of a disappointment to me, most of this work is not being done by psychiatrists nowadays. It's being done by general practitioners and then people in general medicine often, and then also sociologists and social epidemiologists, rightfully so. But I think psychiatry has actually paid less attention to these issues in recent years. These studies all define social integration in different ways. And I want to acknowledge there are many different ways to conceptualize social integration and cohesion. And I think for epidemiologists, this has been a source of debate. I want to point out and discuss one, which is collective efficacy. This was really established by Robert Sampson and colleagues who described it. Robert Sampson is a sociologist who helped lead a study of Chicago neighborhoods, hence this map here, which shows Chicago. And collective efficacy was defined by Sampson and colleagues as social cohesion among neighbors combined with their willingness to intervene on behalf of the common good. And in a key sort of conceptualization, it relies on not so much on strong kinship ties or the kinds of ties between family, but what are called by sociologists weak ties, which are the ties that bind groups of people who are not closely related together through sort of loose affiliations, community organizations, those kinds of things, the kind of passing relationships that you wouldn't necessarily invite this person for dinner, but you might call them up if you wanted to know if there was a job opening somewhere that they worked at, for example. Many people depend, and it may depend on past experiences of efficacy as a community. So talking about trauma, talking about how a lot of communities were dismantled, the sense that you don't have control over the land you live on, of the community you live in, that has the potential to affect the sense of efficacy in the same way that a trauma can affect a personal trauma can affect self-efficacy. Sampson colleagues found that neighborhoods with low collective efficacy in Chicago that was independently predictive of, and again, this is a neighborhood construct, it's measured across a group of people in a community. It is not an individual construct. And in neighborhoods in Chicago with low collective efficacy, there was an increased tendency for community violence. Also, collective efficacy seems to be stable over time. Collective efficacy at one point in time tends to predict future collective efficacy, even when people move into and out of a neighborhood over time. How is this linked to mental health? Well, the data are growing. I think it's a somewhat newer area of research, but it's really collective efficacy as a construct has really only been in popular use for 20 years or so. But studies have found reduced rates of anxiety and depression in adolescence, reduced rates of substance use in adolescence and drinking, reduced rates of high-risk sexual behavior in adolescence. So a lot of adolescent mental health seems to be tied to collective efficacy. That makes sense when you think about collective efficacy as the ability of a community to sort of regulate behavior and set norms and expectations for people. You see reduced rates of major depression, reduced risk of PTSD following a natural disaster. And in what I think is really compelling study, collective efficacy may mediate the links between socioeconomic status and health. It may in fact explain socioeconomic status's link to health in ways that other explanatory models don't, and which helps us get rid of the stigma of quote unquote concentrated poverty, which I think is actually very problematic. So to summarize, how do we get to this issue of collective efficacy through the traumas inflicted on communities? Well, the Hill District is one that Fully Love and Wallace described in their paper on serial displacement. It was once, it was a Black neighborhood, it was segregated, it was nevertheless thriving, there were community organizations. The Hill District experienced all the traumas that we've discussed up to this point, and you can see what happened to the Hill District right here with your own eyes. That's what this photo depicts, urban renewal and displacement. It was once a strong community with various social organizations, but by the 21st century, it was dealing with isolation, political marginalization, fracture, and trauma. And in a social study of the neighborhood, the social scientist Eva Marie Sims interviewed a boy who coined the term unexpectancy to describe the experience of going out into this neighborhood. You couldn't expect anything. You didn't know if you were safe. And here in Detroit, which I've been touching on, is a main street, Woodward Avenue, which is characteristic of main streets in Detroit, in the neighborhoods of Detroit that were so deeply affected by these policies. And as you can see, it's not a hospitable main street. It's wide. There's not space for people. You can see some people walking about. This is a beautiful summer day a few years ago, and yet you don't really see opportunities for people to engage with one another and socialize. And why does this matter? Because, and this is where, you know, I'm going to try to tie these things together. You know, main streets are about many things, but they're about weak ties. They're about creating bonds with each other. They're about sharing a connection to a place. When you think about your neighborhood, people often think about their main street and have a great fondness for it. And so we need that to create that nexus for community connection. And so without that, and in the setting of these traumas, we lost a really important resource for collective efficacy. So in summary, the inhospitable urban space is not conducive to the social processes that underlie collective efficacy. I believe I have like 3 minutes, so I'm gonna just end on what I think is both a sort of a sober note, but also a hopefully an optimistic one. You know, where do we go from here? Well, this is a photo from Tokyo, which is an amazing city, a city filled with street life. And I think this photo also captures, in some ways, both the problem and the solution. This is where we have to deal with the future, which I think this guy kind of represents. And one way to deal with the future is to come together in our communities, and that's what people are doing at this street festival. But what are the problems? We have a lot of vulnerable neighborhoods and a lot of neighborhood inequity. The neighborhoods deemed to be quote unquote vulnerable by the San Francisco Department of Public Health, as depicted in this map in red. There's a mix of different types of neighborhoods, but in particular, neighborhoods of color, neighborhoods populated by the Black population of the city, as well as many of the Latinx population, are incredibly vulnerable to health issues. And what does that look like in practice? Well, here's a map of COVID cases in the city, and you'll notice the areas in blue. For whatever reason, not sure why the Bayview district is grayed out here, and I don't actually know why that is, but many of the vulnerable neighborhoods are the neighborhoods that experience the worst of the pandemic. We have climate change. Many of you probably were at the talk by Drs. Cooper and Trope, who laid out what we're up against with climate change. This is an early projection of, I believe, Hurricane Sandy, which really decimated a lot of Essex County, where I did my work with Mindy. And we recently wrote a paper looking at the impact of Essex County's breakdown in collective efficacy impeding its ability to recover from this type of ecological disaster. And so we need regional collective efficacy. We need to come together as a people across neighborhoods, across cities, across regions to solve these major problems. And we're struggling to do that right now. So what can be done? I'm just going to quickly, because I think it's important not to neglect these, and I'll maybe just go about 1.5 more minutes, lay out a couple possible solutions. So we need to think about cities. We need to think about bringing people together and knitting our communities back together and undoing the legacy of particularly racial injustice in urban planning. That would include things like inclusionary zoning, transit investments, and linking marginalized neighborhoods to the rest of the city. I heard Eric Adams, a candidate for mayor in New York, talk about transit in East New York. I think we need to be thinking about connecting neighborhoods. Egalitarian economic policy is important, and affordable housing and investments are critical. We all know that here in the Bay Area. Architects, I was really, it was great to see that the winners of the Pritzker Prize, the Nobel Prize, essentially in architecture, were two French architects who specialize in preserving and restoring, among other things, public housing and making it joyful and livable without displacing people. And that's an example of what you see here in Bordeaux, France. Mindy Fullylove is involved in the University of Orange. It's a free public university for the community. Just recently, they brought people together to dance in the streets. And I think we need to be dancing in the streets. To be totally honest, it's COVID safe and it's a way to come together. It's free. And then the last thing I'll show is something called tactical urbanism. This is a specialty of the Street Plans Collaborative urban planning firm. This is actually a firm that my wife used to work for, and they take blank spaces in cities and activate them by creating place for people. And they do many other things, but that is one of their specialties. And so with that, I'm gonna stop, and I just want to acknowledge mentors over the years, including Mindy, Mahasa Mujahid, and Irene Yen, who've been mentors to me in research on gentrification. Rick Altice, another research mentor. Ruth Shim and Sarah Vinson edited the chapter that Mindy and I recently wrote, looking at urban issues and social justice, and were very helpful in refining our thinking, my thinking. And then Julie Flynn, my wife, who sparked my love of cities. And I'll stop there. Thank you. And I'll stop the share here.
Jake, that was fantastic. Thank you. Got a couple of comments from people that I'll just read out quickly, and then we're already starting to get some questions, and then we'll wrap up in about 7 minutes. Comments from Maga and Marty saying, excellent presentation, thank you. I think it would be interesting to have a presentation on collective efficacy in the future. And another from Marty saying, I agree, and relate that to identity formation in youth at a future grand rounds.
Yeah, well, I appreciate the comments that people are posting, and I think that, so I noticed one from Tony Yang that was asking about also measures. So there are measures, I don't have them off the top of my head, and I have not myself done what I would consider sort of the social epidemiology of collective efficacy research. In other words, I haven't done a research project that tied a measure of collective efficacy to a health outcome, but those measures are certainly out there, they're used. Sampson and colleagues have measures, I think there are others as well, and they often aggregate, the simplest ones tend to aggregate the responses of individuals in a community around things like, if you needed help with something, would someone help you? They tend to avoid asking people about their own behavior because that can bias the response. But they ask what people's neighbors would do, like, would your neighbors help you out if you lost something, or if you were in need, et cetera. And so, then they aggregate those responses to create a metric of collective efficacy. But I also will note that Sampson did more creative work around collective efficacy by actually doing things like, they did, for example, a letter drop test where they would drop mail on the street that was addressed and stamped, and see how many people would pick it up and put it in a mailbox, depending on the neighborhood and things like that, to actually look at the kinds of behaviors that relate to people sort of essentially looking out for one another. But I think, yeah, I find this issue of collective efficacy very, very compelling, and I think it deserves a lot more attention.
There's another great question asking to relate collective efficacy to anxiety and depression. I think that's a really intriguing question, especially among young adults where it seems epidemic.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, this is a little bit of speculation, but I think actually collective efficacy, I think we have to, I think isolation, you know, people talk a lot about isolation and the lack of social connectedness as a problem in society. There's, you know, there's the bowling alone, you know, another social capital is another big concept that's parallel to collective efficacy. And people talk about bowling alone, for example, which the book that sort of talked about our isolation in contemporary America and its effect on us. And I think that whether you look at social capital or collective efficacy, I do think the data suggests that these constructs are tied to well-being. And I do think we have a collective efficacy problem. I mean, that was the point I was trying to make in looking at climate change and COVID is collective efficacy is how we get big things done as a society. And so I think if we don't come together, we can't solve these problems. I think climate change is like the ultimate collective efficacy problem. Like we absolutely have to figure out how to come together as a large society. And that starts at the community level and builds up from there.
Got some more questions. One is from Damien noting, as I think a number of us have, that psychiatry, and I guess I'll broaden that out, psychiatry, psychology, and mental health services seem underrepresented in social change efforts. What do we imagine for people in clinical, not just academic area, clinicians in those areas?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a really good question. I would argue, I think psychiatry has, at one time, psychiatry was, I think, very involved in social movements. But sort of, there was a little bit of like a retreat from that. I mean, I don't want to, by any means, this just come across as a criticism of, I think, the very important work being done in psychiatric neuroscience, et cetera. But I think the focus has been there in the field. And I think we have an obligation to sort of keep that focus, but expand back into thinking about social life and policy, et cetera. And one of the things I think we could do, I think is being done really by leadership in our department now, is partnering with the city around things like housing and homelessness, community organizations, rebuilding community, looking at things like climate change. So I think that work is actually starting, and I want to give a lot of credit to our department and the leadership in our department for engaging in that way. And I think we just need to keep doing that and build on that.
Tied into that is a provocative anonymous question about the fact that UCSF Psychiatry is getting ready to move into a new building, main, if you would. Any thoughts about that? How do we help our department to help people in this dance in the streets? Which I think is beautiful.
Well, I love this question because I hate to say this, and I'm not going to criticize UCSF right now, but I'll just say generally, medical and academic institutions have been notoriously bad partners to communities. They often have been involved in the very urban renewal that tore up communities. And Rutgers University was what had a not insignificant sort of hand in what happened in Newark, and you see that in elsewhere. I think it's on the university to, if we're going to move into new territory, so to speak, in a city, as we are, to make that a community space that's welcoming. I think UCSF has done some of that in Mission Bay. But for example, there's a beautiful community space in Spark SF down in Mission Bay. I don't know if people have been there, but it's picnic tables and food and everything. And I was there recently, and I mean, there were all kinds of people there. It was incredible community atmosphere. The problem is those places are really just temporarily occupying land that's like slated for development. So these incredible community spaces pop up sometimes, but then like they get torn down because somebody wants to build a permanent building there, which is understandable, but then the community space is gone. So I think, how do we actually marshal our resources? I think at one time I heard the UCSF building was going to have like a cafe that was open to the public on the ground floor. I don't know if that's still true, but that's a good example of something you can do,
It's interesting because that kind of gets into how we value space. I know we're almost we are out of time. If people want to hang out for a few minutes more, we've got a few more questions. One from Peter Stewart. It seems like our diagnostic approach points us to medical rather than social solutions. This is something I've been thinking a lot about. Can you comment on the most productive ways to shift that framework think that's such a key question. I'm wondering if you could tackle that one in a minute.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's a big question, and I know we're at the end, but I think it may not necessitate a shift in our diagnostic approach, although I think there is a problem in our diagnostic approach because there's probably more. We probably can look more at sort of social function and how people are doing in their lives, like well-being, essentially. That may be one answer. I kind of keep it at that because I know we're out of time, but I think it's a really good question.
I'll throw in one more, which is to make sure that we get a good family history, especially when there's family there. I've found that that's really been important to my work at the General. I've got young people coming in, but then if there's a parent, I'll ask them. A lot of the people that I've worked with have given this history and the way that redlining has decimated their family fortunes and caused huge breaks in families. Which really gives me, I mean, you have to listen for it. It was only because I went to a talk that was somewhat similar to this one or touched on some of the same issues that I was even sensitized to those issues. And I saw this guy the next day and his mother. Couldn't understand why his mother was so upset. It really helped me. I want to thank you again on behalf of everyone, Jake. This is such an important area. And I think it does make us look long and hard at some of the really difficult issues that confront us in our society, in our department, in our university. You know, what are our responsibilities? How do we build value? How do we build connections? It's not just about the DSM. So with that, I guess we're going to sign off.
All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
And thank you, everyone.